Welcome to the Empire of Blood. The homecoming of Odysseus is tonight's story. We hope you're sat somewhere cozy and comfortable, because tonight's story will make you want to not move an inch all the way throughout. If you are listening for the first time, we welcome you to our channel and invite you to subscribe and let us know where you are listening from. Now, let's get straight into it. The doors are already locked. No one has noticed yet. Wine is still being poured. Somewhere near the hearth, a man is laughing so hard he has to put his cup down. A dog barks once outside and is ignored. The great hall of Ithaca smells like it always smells at this hour. Roasted meat, spilled wine, the sweat of too many bodies packed too close for too many years. 20. That's how long this house has been eaten alive from the inside. 20 years since its king sailed for Troy, and for most of those years, this hall has belonged to other men. 108 of them at last count. Suitors. Sons of the island's noble families camped in another man's home, drinking another man's wine, courting another man's wife, eating their way through another man's herds, one animal at a time, as if the house itself were a carcass they were slowly stripping to the bone. They have a system for it. They have jokes about it. They have been here so long that cruelty has become a kind of furniture, always present, no longer remarked upon. She has served them tonight, the way she serves them every night. Carried the wine jars, cleared the plates crusted with fat, kept her eyes down when a hand caught her wrist and her ears open when the talk turned, as it always does by midnight, to what will happen to the queen, and to the rest of them, the slaves, the maids, the property, once one of these men finally wins her and takes the throne. She has learned over the years to survive by being unremarkable, invisible labor, a shape that moves through a room without disturbing it. Tonight, there is a beggar in the hall. He arrived that morning, filthy, sunburned, leaning on a staff, the kind of ruined man the island produces by the dozen. Sailors, chewed up by the sea, veterans, chewed up by wars nobody remembers the names of. The suitors mocked him, as they mock everyone beneath them. One threw a footstool at his shoulder. He absorbed it and said nothing. She noticed that. Men who have truly lost everything usually can't stop talking about it. This one had the stillness of someone who has decided already how the night is going to end. She didn't think about it again. Why would she? Beggars come and go. Suitors stay forever. That was the arithmetic of her world. Now it's late. The lamps are guttering, and something is wrong with the room, though she can't yet say what. The weapons are gone. She realizes it slowly, the way you realize a sound has stopped rather than started. The shields that usually hang on the walls, the spears racked by the door, gone, quietly, sometime in the last hour. The suitors are too drunk, too comfortable, too certain of their own permanence to check the walls of a house they've occupied like it was already theirs. The doors to the hall, both of them, the great one and the side one that leads to the yard, have been quietly barred from outside. And the beggar is no longer sitting where a beggar sits. He is standing. He has picked up a bow that until a moment ago was being passed hand to hand among the suitors as a joke. The enormous, ancient bow of the master of this house, brought out on the queen's own strange insistence that whoever could string it and shoot it through a line of axe heads would win her hand. One by one they'd tried and failed, and grown sullen, and gone back to their wine, and the bow had been forgotten in the corner like a punchline nobody found funny anymore. The beggar strings it in one motion. He doesn't struggle with it, he doesn't test it. He draws it back the way a man tunes an instrument he has played his whole life, and he sends the arrow clean through 12 axe heads in a row, and the sound it makes going through them is small and clean and final, like a door latching shut. For one full second, nothing happens. The hall doesn't understand yet what it has just watched. She understands. Not the details, not who he is, not what comes next, not why the doors are barred and the guttering lamps suddenly feel less like ambience and more like a countdown. But she understands the shape of it. She has spent her whole adult life reading rooms for the moment when power changes hands, because that moment is the only one that has ever mattered to someone like her. And she is reading it right now, in the tilt of the beggar's shoulders, in the way the old nurse by the doorway has gone rigid and silent, in the specific, total silence that has just swallowed a room that was laughing 30 seconds ago. Something has already happened. The suitors just don't know it yet. The beggar turns from the target, the row of axes, the joke, the game, and for the first time all night, he looks directly at the men who have spent 20 years eating his home. He says something. Later, she will not be able to tell you exactly what, only that it was short and that his voice did not sound like a beggar's voice at all. Then the second arrow leaves the bow, and it doesn't go anywhere near the axis. Remember this moment. Not the war that came before it. You'll get the war, the horse, the fire, the fame. Not the ocean that came after. The monsters, the gods, the wife weaving and unweaving a shroud while she waited. Start here. In a locked room, with the weapons already gone, and a woman who has survived 20 years of one occupation about to discover that the next one has already begun, and that this time there will be no surviving it by staying quiet and staying useful. Because the man everyone will remember as a hero hasn't come home to rule. He's come home to purge. To understand what happens in that hall, you have to understand the world that made a locked door and 108 corpses look to the people telling this story for the next 3,000 years like a happy ending. Late Bronze Age Greece, or rather the wreckage of it, because by the time our story is set, the Bronze Age world is already dying, though nobody standing in it quite knows that yet. Picture a Mediterranean stitched together by a handful of palace kingdoms, Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, Ithaca among the smaller of them, each ruled by a one-axe, a king who is part warlord, part high priest, part accountant. There is no Greece yet, not as a nation. There are dozens of these kingdoms, related by language and religion, and periodically at each other's throats. This is a world organized, top to bottom, around a single idea, that violence, properly channeled, is the mechanism by which order is made and kept. Not violence as chaos, violence as infrastructure. Kings maintain their thrones through the credible threat of force. Households maintain their honor through the willingness to answer insult with blood. And glory, kleos, the thing every hero in this world is actually chasing, more than gold, more than land, is earned almost exclusively through the killing of other men. A man's name outlives his body only if that name is attached to a body count. This is the ideology the audience of this story already believes, walking in. When the first listeners of this tale, sitting around a fire or in a noble hall not unlike the one in Ithaca, hear that a king killed 108 men in his own home in a single night, their first instinct is not horror, it's admiration. That's the empire we're really examining today. Not a place on a map, an ideology, a moral economy so thoroughly built around martial glory that atrocity and heroism become, from a certain angle, the same act, described by two different words, depending on whose side you're standing on. The war that built the man. The engine that produces Odysseus is the Trojan War, and it's worth being honest about what that war actually was, stripped of the marketing. By legend, it starts with a kidnapped queen, Helen, taken or seduced away from her husband Menelaus, king of Sparta, by a Trojan prince named Paris. Whatever the truth buried under 3,000 years of poetry, historians who study the real Bronze Age see something more mundane and more brutal underneath the myth. A coalition of Greek kingdoms, hungry for the wealth and trade routes controlled by Troy, a city that sits like a toll booth on the strait between the Aegean and the Black Sea. Helen is the story. Plunder and strategic control are very possibly the reason. Whatever the cause, the effect is a decade-long siege, and ancient sieges are not the stuff of epic poetry when you look at them honestly. They are slow-motion atrocities. A city under siege starves. Its wells run dry or get poisoned. Its children die first. And when the walls finally fall, as Troy's do through Odysseus's own genius, a hollow wooden horse smuggled inside the gates, what follows is not a battle. It's a massacre with looting attached. Troy's fall, in the mythic tradition, is a night of fire and butchery. The king, Priam, is killed at his own household altar. The last royal heir, an infant, is thrown from the city walls, so that no claimant survives to seek revenge later. A detail the ancient sources treat almost as a footnote, a piece of prudent statecraft, rather than what it plainly is: the murder of a baby, planned and voted on. The women of the royal house, Hecuba the queen, Cassandra the princess and prophetess, Andromache, the widow of the greatest Trojan hero, Hector, are divided up as spoils among the victorious Greek commanders. Not metaphorically, literally divided, by lot, in front of the ruins of their home, minutes after watching their husbands and sons killed. This is the war Odysseus wins. Not through strength, that's the point the poets always make about him, and it's the key to his whole character. Achilles wins through strength. Ajax wins through strength. Odysseus wins through deception, patience, and the horse. An idea that only works because it exploits an enemy's willingness to trust an apparent gift. The Trojan horse is not a battle. It's a con. And it succeeds so completely that it ends a 10-year war in a single night, at the cost of an entire city's population. The Greek tradition doesn't just forgive this, it venerates it. Odysseus is cunning. The Greek word is metis, cunning intelligence, is treated in Homer and afterward as a form of heroism, at least equal to raw martial strength, maybe superior to it, because it wins wars with fewer of your own men dead. Nobody in that tradition is counting the Trojan dead as a cost. They are not the constituency the story is being told for. Why the world needs men like him. Every one of these Bronze Age kingdoms runs on the same fuel: expansion, tribute, and the periodic renewal of a king's reputation through violence. A king who cannot win wars is a king who cannot hold his throne. Rivals sense weakness the way sharks sense blood, and in a world with no real concept of legitimacy beyond "can you defend what's yours?" reputation is security. Scale matters here. A kingdom the size of Mycenae can absorb the loss of a king. A kingdom the size of Ithaca cannot. It has, essentially, one household, one bloodline, and one man's reputation standing between order and collapse. Which is precisely why 20 years of his absence doesn't produce a smooth regency. It produces exactly what we saw at the start of this episode: a power vacuum, filled by the most aggressive men available. And the system needs his particular skill set specifically: the cunning, the willingness to lie, to disguise himself, to manipulate people's trust and turn it into a weapon. Because open combat is expensive and uncertain, and deception is cheap and reliable, provided you don't care what it costs the people you deceive. A society that rewards physical strength produces warriors who are, in some basic sense, honest about what they are. Achilles never pretends to be anything other than a killer and dies still being exactly that, openly, on a battlefield everyone can see. A society that rewards cunning produces something different and arguably more dangerous. Men who are professionally skilled at appearing to be one thing while being another. Men for whom deception isn't a lapse in character, it's the whole character. It's the resume. Odysseus is Ithaca's answer to a Bronze Age arms race in trickery, and a kingdom that produces a weapon like that does not get to be surprised later when the weapon comes home and starts using its skills on the household that built it. The women left behind. There's a second empire hiding inside this one, and it's the one most of this episode is actually going to live inside. So let's set the terms now.
Bronze Age Greek women, free or enslaved, and the line between those two categories is far thinner and far more violently policed than most retellings admit, exist within a household economy defined by the presence or absence of a controlling man. A married woman's status depends on her husband. An enslaved woman's status depends on her owner and can change overnight based on nothing she did, inherited, gifted, seized as spoils, as Troy's royal women were seized, in stories nobody bothered to write down because the women in them weren't the ones the poems were for. For 20 years, Ithaca has been a household with its controlling man absent, presumed dead by most for most of that time, and that absence is not a neutral fact. It is a vacuum, and vacuums in this world get filled by force. The suitors occupying the palace are not simply rude houseguests. They are, in the logic of this culture, exercising a claim. If the king is dead, or as good as dead, the widow and the estate become available, contestable, up for a grim competition among the island's ambitious men. The queen, Penelope, has spent 2 decades holding off that competition through increasingly desperate stalling tactics, most famously weaving a burial shroud for her father-in-law by day and secretly unraveling it by night, buying years of delay through an act of quiet, exhausting sabotage that the poem treats as clever and admirable, and which was, underneath the cleverness, pure survival under siege. And underneath her, at the very bottom of this household's hierarchy, are the enslaved women, a class of people the epic tradition barely bothers to individuate. Women captured or purchased or born into this household, with no name recognized outside it, whose entire existence for these 20 years has been defined by a single, brutal calculation, repeated daily. How do I survive the men currently holding power over me? For most of 2 decades, the honest answer has been, serve the suitors. Not because they wanted to, because refusal, in a locked household controlled by armed men, was never actually a choice with a safe outcome attached. Some of these women were coerced into sexual relationships with the suitors. The ancient sources are blunt about this, in a way translators have often softened. Some simply worked, cooked, cleaned, endured. All of them made their accommodations to the only power actually present in that house, because the alternative to accommodation, in a world with no concept of protecting the powerless from the powerful, was not principled resistance. It was death, or worse, with no one to answer for it. They did what every occupied population in history has done. They adapted to survive an occupation they did not choose and could not end. They had no way of knowing that a jury was on its way home across the sea, one that would judge every single one of those 20 years of survival and offer no appeal. The gap starts here. Here is the seam in the story, the one this whole episode is going to keep pressing on because it never closes. From the top, from the throne room, from 3,000 years of poetry sung in halls exactly like the one you just watched get locked. Odysseus's cunning is intelligence. His deception is strategy. His homecoming is the restoration of rightful order after 20 years of chaos, and everyone who obstructed that restoration gets what a corrupt world owes them. From the ground, from the hold of a captured ship at Troy, from the servants' quarters of a locked palace, from 12 women about to discover exactly how their king intends to sort the loyal from the disloyal. His cunning is unpredictability. His deception is a weapon that could be turned on anyone at any time without warning, because that is precisely what deception is built to do. And his homecoming is not a restoration. It is a reset. Total, violent, and utterly indifferent to the specific human costs of the 20 years he was gone. Both of these are true at once. That's not a contradiction in the story. It's the entire point of telling it this way. The law of the guest. There is one more institution you need in your pocket before we go any further, because it is going to detonate quietly in almost every segment left in this episode. It's called Xenia, the sacred law of hospitality, and in this world it is not etiquette.
It is closer to religious law, enforced, the Greeks believed, by Zeus himself in his aspect of protector of strangers. The rule is simple and absolute. A host must shelter, feed, and protect any stranger who arrives at his door, without first demanding to know who they are. A guest, in turn, must not abuse that shelter. Xenia is the glue holding together a world with no police force and no international law. A traveler survives only because the stranger who opens their door is bound by something stronger than personal preference to take them in. Keep that law in your head, because everyone in this story is either violating it or invoking it, all the way through. The suitor's entire crime, the crime the epic wants you to see as monstrous enough to justify everything that follows, is fundamentally a violation of Xenia. They arrived as guests, and they never left.
They ate a household's wealth for 20 straight years, refused to take no for an answer from a woman under no obligation to marry any of them, and treated a king's absence as an opportunity rather than a tragedy. Under the logic of Xenia, they are not simply rude, they are guilty. Guilty of the one crime this entire social order considers nearly unforgivable. Remember that when Odysseus arrives back at his own door disguised as a beggar, and the household, bound by that exact same law, takes him in. Remember it when he uses that hospitality, that trust, as cover for a surveillance operation. And remember it, above all, when the story asks you to accept that violating Xenia earns the suitors a death sentence with no trial, while Odysseus's own use of disguised hospitality as a weapon is never once framed by the poem as a violation of anything at all.
One last irony before we leave the world building, because we, on this end of history, can't unknow it. Within a generation or two of this story's setting, the entire palace civilization that produced men like Odysseus collapses. Mycenae burns. Pylos burns. Writing itself disappears from Greece for nearly 400 years. The stories about Troy and its heroes are composed and recomposed by oral poets working in the centuries after that collapse, singing about a vanished world of palace kings to audiences living in something much poorer, until the messy accounting of who actually suffered has been sanded down, retelling by retelling, into a timeless fable about a clever man finding his way home. The erasure of the powerless from this story didn't start with Homer. It started earlier, and it never stopped.
So who was he before the bow, before the horse, before he became the man capable of standing in a locked hall, watching a room full of drunk, unarmed men, and deciding, calmly, that the correct response was all of them? That's next. The island that made him. Start small, because Odysseus does. Ithaca is not Mycenae, it's not Sparta. It is a rocky, goat-thin island off the western coast of Greece, small enough that a king can know most of his subjects by name, poor enough that its royal house has to be resourceful rather than merely wealthy to matter at all. Odysseus doesn't inherit an empire. He inherits a hard, narrow, defensible rock. That matters because it shapes what kind of man this environment is capable of producing. You do not survive as a small king surrounded by larger, hungrier neighbors through raw force. You survive through alliance, through reputation, through knowing exactly which fights to avoid and which insults to answer, through being. And this is the word that follows Odysseus from his earliest appearances all the way to his grave. Clever. His grandfather, by most tellings, is a man named Autolycus, and the tradition is not shy about what Autolycus was famous for. He's a trickster, a thief said to be favored by Hermes, the god of liars and thieves, gifted with the ability to steal things and make them untraceable. It's Autolycus who names the infant Odysseus, and in the Greek, the name itself is loaded. It derives from a verb meaning to cause pain or to be hated, a name that essentially means trouble, given deliberately as a kind of prophecy. Somewhere in the household telling this story to its own children, there is already an understanding, generations before Troy. This bloodline produces men whose gift is making other people suffer for it, and calling it cleverness. Picture him young, and every tradition agrees on this part, being formally trained not primarily in sword work, though he can fight, but in persuasion, strategy, and rhetoric. In a culture that worships physical prowess above almost everything, Odysseus is being groomed, deliberately, as something rarer and more unsettling. A mind being sharpened as a weapon. And here's the parallel this show exists to keep surfacing, episode after episode. While a young Odysseus is being tutored in the skills that will one day let him talk his way past a Cyclops or build a horse that ends a war, somewhere on that same island, in the same years, other children are being born into households with no path upward at all. Born enslaved, or born poor enough that slavery is only ever one bad harvest away. Nobody is grooming them. The very same social order that is cultivating Odysseus's intelligence as a prized resource is, at the exact same time, treating the intelligence, the personhood, the interiority of everyone beneath him as functionally irrelevant. That gap between the boy whose mind is being built into a legendary instrument and the children around him whose minds nobody is asking about at all is not a footnote. It's the blueprint for everything that happens 20 years later in that hall. The marriage, and the first lie he tells the world. Before Troy, before any of it, there is a wedding, and even the wedding is built on a piece of Odysseus's cunning, which should tell you how early this pattern sets in. He travels to Sparta as one of dozens of suitors competing for the hand of Helen. Yes, that Helen. Years before she becomes the pretext for the war that will define his life. He has no real chance of winning her. Ithaca is too small. He's too poor next to the wealthier kings courting her. So instead of competing directly, he does something characteristically indirect. He proposes, to Helen's stepfather Tyndareus, a solution to the problem the man is visibly terrified of. That whichever suitor loses will hold a grudge violent enough to tear the Greek world apart. Odysseus suggests every suitor swear a binding oath in advance to defend the winner's marriage against any future threat, no matter who is chosen. Tyndareus agrees. The oath is sworn, and in exchange for solving a problem that isn't even his, Odysseus asks for one favor in return. Help winning the hand of Tyndareus's niece, Penelope, instead. He gets her, and he gets something else, too. When Helen is later taken to Troy, the oath he engineered becomes the legal and moral mechanism that drags every one of those suitors and every kingdom under their command into a decade-long war. The very first act of cleverness in Odysseus's adult life is a piece of diplomatic engineering that avoids a small local conflict by constructing a legal trap, one that will later detonate into the largest war his world has ever seen. He didn't cause the war, but he built one of the load-bearing mechanisms that made it structurally inevitable. And he did it, as ever, to get something he personally wanted. The war he tried to fake his way out of. And here's the detail the heroic tradition almost never leads with, because it complicates the legend of the willing warrior a little too much. When the call to honor that oath finally comes, Odysseus does not want to go. He has a newly married wife, an infant son Telemachus barely old enough to be held, and, by more than one ancient source, a prophecy warning that if he goes to Troy, he won't return home for 20 years and will arrive with nothing and no one. So he fakes madness. When the Greek recruiters arrive at Ithaca to collect him, they find their cleverest potential asset yoking together an ox and a donkey, animals whose mismatched strides make it impossible to till a straight furrow, and sowing the field not with seed, but with salt, muttering and staggering like a man who has lost his mind entirely, hoping to be judged unfit for war and left alone. It very nearly works, and it's undone by an act of cruelty that should tell you everything about how this world tests the sincerity of a lie. One of the recruiters, a man named Palamedes, suspects the madness is a performance and devises a test. He takes the infant Telemachus from Penelope's arms and sets him directly in the path of Odysseus's plow. A genuinely insane man, the logic runs, wouldn't stop for his own child. A sane man, pretending to be insane, would swerve. Odysseus swerves. The lie is exposed in front of his entire household in the single moment where the stakes were his own infant son's life, and he is conscripted on the spot. He never forgives Palamedes for the trick, and years later, at Troy, when the opportunity arises, Odysseus is widely credited across several ancient sources with engineering Palamedes' death through a frame-up, planting forged evidence and stolen gold to make it look as though Palamedes were a Trojan spy, then standing by or actively participating while the other Greek commanders stone an innocent man to death for treason he never committed. Notice the shape of that story, because you're going to see it again. A man tests Odysseus's honesty using the one leverage point sharp enough to work, successfully exposes a lie, and pays for that exposure years later with his own life. Engineered by exactly the kind of fabricated evidence and patient, cold-blooded manipulation that will one day be turned with much higher stakes on an entire hall full of people who never saw it coming either. What he believes before anyone tests it. Every man in this series has an ideology before he has a body count. A story, he tells himself, that makes what's coming feel not just permissible, but righteous. Odysseus's is deceptively simple, and it's one you've probably absorbed without noticing, because Western culture absorbed it wholesale from him. Survival justifies deception, and intelligence is a form of superiority that entitles you to use it. And the gods themselves seem to agree. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategy, takes a personal, almost obsessive interest in Odysseus throughout his life, appearing to him, guiding him, at times literally reshaping his physical appearance to help a lie land more convincingly. When the most powerful advocate for wisdom in your entire religion has picked you as her favorite and consistently rewards your deceptions with success, you don't walk away with humility. You walk away believing cunning is sanctioned, blessed, the mechanism by which the universe itself has decided you deserve to win. This is the education Odysseus receives over and over. Every time I deceive someone, I win, and everyone calls it genius. And every clever victory in this story leaves someone standing in the wreckage who never saw it coming. Someone the narrative simply declines to follow home. The war. 10 years at Troy do to Odysseus roughly what 10 years of open war do to anyone. They narrow him. Whatever complexity he arrived with gets ground down into a small set of hard, efficient behaviors, tested and retested under extreme stress until they harden into instinct. He becomes, within the Greek camp, a specialist in dirty work, the man sent on the missions too risky and too morally compromising for the war's showier heroes. In one episode from the tradition, he's part of a nighttime raid that ends with the killing of a sleeping enemy scout, information extracted from the man before his throat is cut. An act the tradition frames as brilliant tactics, not murder, because the target wore the wrong uniform. A second raid, conducted the same night alongside the warrior Diomedes, shows the pattern in an even starker light. Acting on intelligence pulled from the scout they've just killed, the two men slip through the lines to the camp of Rhesus, a Thracian king who has only just arrived to reinforce Troy. They find Rhesus and his men asleep, unarmed, unaware, days from having fired a single arrow in this war, and kill 13 of them in their sleep, one after another, working quietly enough not to wake the others, before driving off the king's prized horses as trophies. In purely tactical terms, an immaculate operation. Described without the poetry, 13 men murdered in their beds before they ever had the chance to fight, for the crime of showing up to defend a city under siege, remembered, in the tradition, not as an atrocity, but as one of Odysseus's early masterstrokes. He's central to schemes that read, stripped of 3,000 years of admiring poetry, as psychological warfare bordering on cruelty for its own sake, including, in some tellings, identifying and exposing Achilles when the younger hero is hidden away by a mother desperate to keep her son out of a war that prophecy has promised will kill him. Odysseus finds him anyway. Achilles goes to Troy. Achilles dies at Troy, exactly as the prophecy warned. Ask yourself, how many nights in the years after Odysseus spent thinking about that particular piece of cleverness? And when the city finally falls, through his idea, he does not flinch from what follows. The killing of Priam at the altar, the infant heir thrown from the walls, the division of Troy's women parceled out among the victors like livestock in front of the smoking ruins of everything they'd ever known. Odysseus is not a bystander to any of this. He is one of the architects of the strategy that produced it, and he walks away from Troy's ashes with prizes of his own, and with a reputation already as the single cleverest man in the entire Greek expedition. Walk through the horse itself for a moment, because the plan only works through a very specific kind of discipline. The design is Odysseus's. The Greek fleet burns its own camp and pretends to sail away in defeat, leaving behind a single massive wooden horse, with an inscription claiming it as an offering to Athena. Inside its hollow belly, packed shoulder to shoulder in the dark, are roughly 24 of the Greeks' best fighters, Odysseus among them, commanding them from inside, utterly dependent on the Trojans making exactly the choice he has gambled everything on, hauling a strange, unexplained object through their own gates. A Greek soldier named Sinon is left behind, deliberately, as bait. Captured, fed to the Trojans, along with a fabricated story, under staged duress, about why the horse must be brought inside the walls. Sinon lies expertly to men who are about to die for believing him, and inside the horse the hidden men can hear, faintly, an entire city debating its own doom. Trojan voices arguing, at one point in the tradition, right at the horse's flank, close enough that the men crouched inside have to physically restrain each other, one soldier clamping a hand over another's mouth when a woman's voice, eerily mimicking the wives left behind in Greece, calls softly to them by name. That is the specific psychological discipline Odysseus has spent a decade cultivating and now demands of every man under his command. The ability to sit in the dark, inches from discovery, and say nothing while a city decides whether to trust you. That night, once the city has gone to sleep, half drunk on the belief that the siege is finally over, Odysseus and the others climb down, open the gates from within, and let the returned Greek army pour into a city that has just spent its last night on earth congratulating itself on survival. 10 years. That's the furnace this man comes out of. And the journey that follows, the 10 years that give the Odyssey its name, the wandering generations of readers have taught themselves to read as an adventure story, is, underneath, the story of exactly what a furnace like that produces once it's set loose on the world with no war left to focus it on. The long unraveling. Here's where the myth usually gets told as a series of colorful set pieces: a giant, a witch, a sea monster, a nymph on an island paradise. And where this episode is going to insist on reading every one of them for what they reveal about the man at their center, and about the men serving under him who don't survive to make it home. The Cyclops. Odysseus and his crew land on the island of a one-eyed giant named Polyphemus, and here you get, in miniature, the entire pattern of the man's life. They enter the giant's cave, uninvited and, by their own later account, specifically hoping to test the guest customs of a creature they already suspect might be dangerous, gambling with the crew's safety out of curiosity. The gamble goes badly. Polyphemus traps them, and over the following days eats 6 of Odysseus's men alive, 2 at a time, smashing their skulls against the cave floor first. Odysseus's response, and it is brilliant, there's no honest way to tell this story without admitting that, is to get the giant drunk, tell him his name is Nobody, blind his single eye with a fire-hardened stake while he sleeps, and escape by having his remaining men cling to the undersides of the giant's sheep as they're let out to pasture, so that the blinded Polyphemus, feeling only their woolly backs, doesn't detect the men riding beneath. It works. It is, genuinely, one of the great problem-solving sequences in the history of storytelling. And then Odysseus, safely back on his ship, sailing away from an island holding a screaming, blinded giant, cannot help himself. He shouts back his real name. Not out of necessity, out of pride. He needs Polyphemus, and by extension the wider world, to know exactly which clever man did this to him, so that the glory attaches to the correct name. Polyphemus, it turns out, is the son of Poseidon, god of the sea, and Poseidon, hearing his son's prayer for vengeance, spends the next decade making sure Odysseus's voyage home becomes a slow-motion catastrophe. The single act of vanity in an otherwise flawless escape, the need to be known, the inability to simply survive without also being credited, is the specific decision that turns a difficult voyage into a 10-year odyssey of death. And who pays for that decision over and over? Not Odysseus in the end. His crew. Every man on those ships who never asked to be shouted at a vengeful god's son on their captain's behalf. Circe. On the island of the witch goddess Circe, the first advance party of his men is transformed into pigs. Genuinely, physically transformed, penned and squealing, retaining, in some versions, just enough human awareness to understand exactly what has happened to them, which is its own particular horror. Odysseus, protected by a herb given to him by the god Hermes, goes to confront her alone, and the poem stages what follows almost as a negotiation between equals. Circe, disarmed and impressed by a mortal immune to her power, invites him to her bed instead of her sty. He accepts. And notice the order of operations, because it's the same instinct that got him a wife back in Sparta. Before anything else, he makes Circe swear an oath not to harm him further. Himself first. His men's restoration to human form second. And only after both boxes are checked does he settle in for what becomes a full year. 12 months of feasting and comfort in the bed of the goddess, who days earlier had been penning his crew like livestock, while a wife on Ithaca ages alone and a son grows toward manhood without him. It's Odysseus's own men, eventually, who have to remind him, gently, carefully, the way you remind a king of something he doesn't want to hear, that they have homes too, and that comfort has a way of quietly becoming forever if nobody names it out loud. Calypso. Later, alone, having by this point lost every single one of his men, and we'll get to how, Odysseus washes up on the island of the nymph Calypso, who keeps him as a lover for 7 years. The tradition frames this as captivity, and in fairness, in the surviving poetry he does eventually weep on the shore, longing for home, refusing her offer of immortality if he'll stay forever. But 7 years is 7 years. And meanwhile, on Ithaca, a household is being devoured, and the story asks you to feel sympathy for the captain, comfortable in a goddess's bed, rather than horror at the length of an absence everyone back home has to survive without him. The land of the dead. Somewhere in the middle of that voyage, on Circe's instruction, Odysseus does something almost no other hero in this tradition is asked to do. He sails to the edge of the world, fills a trench with sacrificial blood, and calls the dead up out of the underworld to speak with him, one at a time, drawn by the smell of blood like moths to a lamp. The first ghost isn't even someone he expected. It's Elpenor, the youngest and least distinguished of his crew, who died stupidly and recently, falling drunk off Circe's roof the morning they departed, his body left behind unburied in the chaos of leaving. His ghost begs for nothing more than a proper burial, a request so small and so human, it lands harder than almost anything else in the poem, a reminder of how replaceable individual men had become to their captain. Then his mother's ghost approaches, Anticlea, who Odysseus didn't even know had died, who tells him she died of grief, specifically waiting for a son who never came home and never sent word. He tries 3 times to embrace her, and 3 times his arms close on empty air, because the dead in this tradition have no substance to hold. A detail that reads less like fantasy world building and more like the single most honest image of loss in the entire epic. A son reaching for a mother he abandoned to grief and finding nothing there to catch. And then Achilles, dead now, killed at Troy exactly as the prophecy always said, the single greatest warrior of his generation. Odysseus greets him with exactly the flattery this culture reserves for its dead heroes. Surely, even in death, he must rule as a king among the shades, glory intact. Achilles' answer is the most devastating line in the entire poem. He says he would rather be a poor, landless laborer, working for a farmer too poor to feed him properly, alive on the earth, than rule as king over the entire population of the dead. The man whose short, glorious life was the shining advertisement for this culture's obsession with Kleos tells Odysseus, from beyond the grave, that he got it wrong. That glory bore nothing worth having, that every myth this world tells its young men about the trade, a short life for an eternal name, was a lie the living tell themselves, because the dead aren't consulted. Odysseus says nothing back. The poem doesn't record a rebuttal, doesn't let the moment resolve into anything except silence. It's the closest this entire tradition ever comes to admitting, out loud, that the value system justifying everything in this episode, the war, the horse, the 600 dead crewmen, the hall full of corpses still to come, might have been built on a foundation that even its most celebrated beneficiary, dead and honest at last, no longer believes in. One more ghost matters here. Ajax, the hero who lost the contest for Achilles' armor to Odysseus, a contest many ancient sources agree was won through political maneuvering and persuasive speech rather than merit, and who took his own life from the shame of losing it, approaches, sees Odysseus, and turns away without a word. Odysseus calls after him, tries to make peace, offers regret. Ajax says nothing and walks back into the darkness. Even the dead in this poem know exactly what kind of victories this man's cleverness tends to produce.
The crew he loses. Here is the number the myth almost never makes you confront. Odysseus leaves Troy with 12 ships and roughly 600 men. He arrives home to Ithaca alone. Some die to monsters. Scylla, the six-headed horror who plucks 6 men straight off the deck and eats them alive while their crewmates row on, helpless, because Odysseus, warned in advance exactly what Scylla would do, made the calculated decision not to tell his men, reasoning, in the poem's own account of his thinking, that they'd only panic and stop rowing if they knew. 6 men who die not knowing what was about to happen to them, kept in the dark by their own captain's private risk calculation.
Some die to their own desperate hunger, trapped and starving on the island of the sun god Helios, forbidden by prophecy to touch the god's sacred cattle. They eventually break, slaughter the cattle anyway, and are wiped out to the last man by a divine storm. While Odysseus, who happened to be asleep when the slaughter began, survives. Some die to a captain's misjudgment, 11 of his 12 ships destroyed in a single ambush by the cannibal Laestrygonians, who crush the fleet with boulders hurled from cliffs above a harbor and spear the swimming survivors like fish. A slaughter that happens because Odysseus led his fleet into a harbor he hadn't adequately scouted. By the time he reaches Ithaca, every last one of the 600 is dead. He alone survives. And the myth, for 3,000 years, has mostly asked its audience to read this as tragedy that happened to Odysseus, storms, monsters, cruel gods, rather than as the outcome of a pattern in which a brilliant, self-regarding captain's decisions, the shouted name, the year with Circe, the withheld warning, the unscouted harbor, are never quite separated from the deaths that follow them. 600 families on Ithaca and its surrounding islands who will never see their husbands, sons, and fathers again. 600 households that don't get an epic poem written about their grief. Just one captain, coming home clever and alone, to a story that will spend the next 3,000 years calling him a hero for it.
The critical shift. By the time Odysseus's raft finally washes up on Ithaca's shore, disguised, again, always disguised, by Athena's magic this time, as an old beggar, something fundamental has changed in him, and the myth marks the change clearly, even if it rarely names it honestly. He does not walk into his own hall and announce himself. He does not test the waters gently, extend trust cautiously, give his household the benefit of the doubt after 20 years apart. He infiltrates his own home. This is the turn from survivor to executioner, and it's worth being precise about what that turn actually is. A survivor arriving home after 20 years of trauma might reasonably want answers, want loyalty tested, want to understand what happened in his absence before acting. What Odysseus does instead is run a covert surveillance operation on his own household, evaluating every person in it against a private, unstated standard of loyalty they were never told they'd be judged by, and reserving for himself the sole authority to decide unilaterally who lives and who dies based on the results. Not reclaim, not restore. Purge. A total one-time, irreversible sorting of an entire household into the saved and the condemned, conducted by a man whose entire adult life, war and voyage both, has been one long education in the idea that deception, wielded confidently enough, wins. He is standing now, disguised, in his own front hall, watching. And somewhere in that same hall, a woman who has spent 20 years surviving an occupation she never chose is about to serve him wine without the faintest idea that the man drinking it has already decided in some cold private chamber of his mind exactly how her story is going to end. The bow is still in the corner. The weapons haven't been quietly removed yet, but the sorting has already begun. The disguise as surveillance apparatus. Every system of mass violence in history needs an intake process, some method for identifying who's a threat, who's useful, who's disposable, before the actual violence begins. What makes Odysseus's homecoming so specifically chilling is that the intake process is the man himself. There's no bureaucracy here, no separate apparatus of informants and interrogators. Odysseus, personally, disguised as a broken old beggar, walks his own halls for days, functioning simultaneously as spy, judge, and, soon enough, executioner. Picture the texture of those days. He sits by the hearth, ignored or mocked, absorbing every conversation that happens around him, because nobody bothers to lower their voice in front of a beggar. He talks to the swineherd, Eumaeus, testing his loyalty with careful, roundabout questions before ever revealing himself. He endures, deliberately, strategically endures, insults and even physical violence from the suitors, because provoking their contempt gives him a clearer picture of exactly how far their cruelty extends when they think no consequences are coming. And critically, he watches the women of the household. This is where the surveillance turns most directly toward the 12 enslaved maids whose fate anchors the rest of this episode. Odysseus notices, the poem is explicit about this, which of the household's women speak to him with contempt, assuming him worthless, which mock him openly in front of the suitors, currying favor with the men currently holding power in the house, and which, like the maid named Melantho, go further still, sharing an actual relationship with one of the suitors, a choice she has made, in a house under 20 years of hostile occupation, about how to survive it. He files every observation away. Every one of them is about to become evidence in a trial none of these women know is happening, presided over by a judge they don't know is present, according to a standard they had no opportunity to prepare for. Now, put yourself for a moment into the woman's position. 20 years. You did not choose the men who occupied your home any more than you chose to be born enslaved into it. You have had, in any meaningful sense, no genuinely free choices, only degrees of danger calculated daily. And now, unknown to you, a man is sitting by your own hearth, disguised, cataloging every one of those survival choices as if they were freely made moral decisions in a stable, safe world. A world that, for you, has not existed in 2 decades. This is what surveillance looks like when it's conducted by someone who has already decided in advance that context won't be admissible. The boy who becomes a killer in one night. There's a second transformation happening inside this machine that the poem treats as a triumphant coming-of-age story, and that this episode wants you to look at more carefully. The making of Telemachus. When we first meet him, Telemachus is barely more than a boy. 20 years old, technically a man by his culture's reckoning, but cowed in his own household, unable to even command the suitors to leave. Athena, in disguise, has to personally coach him through his first acts of independent will, sending him on a voyage to Pylos and Sparta to ask after his missing father, less because the information matters, and more because the journey itself is the education. a crash course in the skills his father has spent a lifetime perfecting. How to read a room of powerful men, how to speak persuasively, how to carry yourself like someone who cannot be pushed around. He comes home changed, more confident, more willing to conceal, plan, and act.
And within days of his return, his father arrives in disguise, takes him fully into the plot, and by the end of that same night, this recently uncertain boy has driven a spear through the back of a man some of the household genuinely liked, has helped bar the doors on a room designed to kill everyone inside it, and has assisted in stringing up 12 women he almost certainly grew up around, playing in the same halls as a child. The poem frames this as Telemachus finally becoming a man, worthy of his father's name and throne. It's worth asking, quietly, what exactly this culture understood becoming a man to require, and whether a boy capable of executing women he'd known his whole life in a single night at his father's direction without visible hesitation is a portrait of maturity, or a portrait of exactly how efficiently this particular machine could manufacture the next generation of men willing to run it. Recruiting the machine's other hands. Odysseus doesn't do this alone. 2 other men make it possible: Eumaeus, the swineherd, and Philotius, the cowherd, loyal servants who never wavered during the occupation, who fed and sheltered the disguised beggar without knowing who he was, purely because hospitality and old loyalty demanded it. Odysseus tests both before revealing himself, the same way he tests everyone, asking, in careful, hypothetical language, what they would do if their old master somehow returned. Both answer correctly, without knowing they're being evaluated. Only then are they told the truth, armed and given assignments. Guard this door, block that exit, be ready when the signal comes. 2 ordinary working men with no history of violence, transformed within a single conversation into essential components of a mass execution. Because their king asked, and because everything in their world had taught them that refusing a king wasn't a real option for men in their position. Removing the weapons. The mechanics of a massacre are, underneath the poetry, logistics, and Odysseus, ever the strategist, treats them exactly that way. Working with Telemachus, he arranges to have the hall's weapons, the shields and spears that traditionally hang along its walls, quietly removed under a cover story, carried up to a storeroom on the pretext that the smoke of the hall's fires has been tarnishing them and they need cleaning. It's a small, almost bureaucratic lie, and it is devastatingly effective, because nobody in that hall, suitor or servant, thinks to question why weapons are being moved on a night that, to everyone but 2 people, looks like any other. This is control established before violence begins, a pattern this show has now traced across 6 different empires and 6 different architects of atrocity. The moment of dramatic violence is almost never the moment that decides the outcome. The outcome is decided earlier, quietly, in the logistics. Who has weapons and who doesn't? Who knows what's coming and who doesn't? Who has been positioned, without their knowledge, into a room they cannot leave? By the time the first arrow flies, the suitors are already defeated. They just don't know it. 108 armed, able-bodied, aristocratic young men have been rendered as helpless as livestock, through nothing more dramatic than a story about tarnished bronze and a locked storeroom door. The execution. What follows when Odysseus finally reveals himself, stringing the great bow that only he in the whole hall can draw, then turning it from the axe heads to the crowd, is not a battle in any sense the word usually implies. A battle has 2 sides, with some chance, however slim, of prevailing. This is a locked room. An armed man supported by his son and 2 armed herdsmen against a crowd of drunk, weaponless men with nowhere to run. The first arrow is aimed with particular deliberateness.
Odysseus waits until the man he most despises, Antinous, the suitor's de facto ringleader, the loudest voice for taking Penelope by force, the one who threw the footstool at the beggar's shoulder earlier that same night, lifts a golden cup of wine to his lips. The arrow takes him through the throat, mid-swallow. He falls backward off his chair, the cup spinning out of his hand, wine and blood pooling together on the floor before most of the room has even registered the sound of the bowstring. For one more suspended second, the rest of the suitors think it's an accident, a wild shot, a drunken misfire, because the alternative, that the beggar in the corner has just executed the son of their leading family on purpose, is too large to process.
Then Odysseus speaks, tells them plainly who he is and why they are all about to die, and the hall breaks into the particular specific chaos of 100 armed instincts discovering in the same instant that they have no weapons at all. The killing that follows is systematic. Odysseus works through the hall methodically, arrow after arrow, and when the arrows run out, sword and spear, cutting down suitors as they scramble over furniture, barricade themselves behind overturned tables, beg, some of them explicitly beg, offering to repay everything 100-fold, offering anything that might buy a way out of a room they cannot leave. One suitor, Amphinomus, a man some of the household had actually liked, who had at times spoken against the worst of his companion's behavior, rushes Odysseus directly rather than wait to be hunted down, and is speared through the back by Telemachus, dying without ever learning whether his occasional decency was going to be weighed in his favor.
It wasn't. Nothing is weighed. There is no ledger kept that night except a single binary one. Present in this hall, or not. Another suitor, Laodes, a man the text is careful to note actually opposed the worst of his companion's behavior, who tried repeatedly to restrain the others, throws down his weapons and clutches Odysseus's knees in the ancient gesture of formal supplication, a gesture that, throughout this entire cultural world, is supposed to compel mercy, one of the most sacred obligations a person can invoke. He begs for his life on exactly those grounds, that he tried to do right, that he deserves to be judged on his own conduct rather than his companion's. Odysseus beheads him mid-plea with a single stroke, and the poem records it without apparent discomfort. Because in the moral logic of the story being told, Laodes' presence in that hall, eating that king's food for those 20 years, outweighs any individual restraint he showed within it. By the time it's over, all 108 suitors are dead. The floor of the great hall, the poem tells us directly, is slick with blood. So slick that afterward it has to be washed with water and scrubbed with sulfur before the house can be considered clean again. A detail almost administrative in its specificity. The kind of detail you get when a text is more interested in the aftermath's logistics than in dwelling on the horror of the act itself. Moral classification. Here is where the machine turns from the suitors to the household's own women, and where this episode's central tension sharpens to its finest point. With the suitors dead, Odysseus turns to sorting the household staff, specifically the 12 enslaved women who, over the course of the occupation, had entered into relationships, willing or coerced, or somewhere in the impossible territory between those two words, with the men now lying dead on the hall floor. The standard applied is simple, retroactive, and entirely one-sided. Loyalty, defined as having refused any accommodation with the occupying men. Disloyalty, defined as having made any accommodation at all, regardless of what refusal might actually have cost a woman with no protection, no recourse, and no power. Consider what loyalty, by this standard, would actually have required. Refusing men who held total physical and economic power over her, with no guarantee that refusal would be honored rather than punished. Staking her physical safety on the eventual return of a king nobody had confirmed was even alive. Trusting he would someday come back, remember her specifically, and reward a resistance that in the meantime might have gotten her beaten, killed, or simply replaced by someone more compliant. And notice that the standard was never actually communicated. Nobody in that household, not the maids, not the swineherd, not the queen herself until very late in the process, was told at any point during those 20 years that a reckoning was coming, or what conduct it would reward and punish. A rule you can be executed for breaking, but that you were never told existed, isn't really a rule at all. It's a trap, retrofitted after the fact to make an already decided outcome look like justice. That's worth naming plainly because it's exactly the same rhetorical move you'll see again and again across this show, in empire after empire. Violence committed first, and the standard used to justify it assembled only afterward, out of whatever behavior happened to be available to condemn. Punishment and erasure. The sorting produces its verdict quickly. Telemachus, at his father's direction, selects 12 of the household's maids, the ones identified through Odysseus's surveillance and the household's own testimony as having been closest to the suitors, and orders them first to clean the hall, to carry out the bodies of the men they had in some cases been intimate with, to scrub the blood and gore from the floor and furniture with water and sulfur, working through the wreckage of a massacre with their own hands. Only after that labor is complete does the sentence arrive. The 12 women are led out to a narrow space between the house and the courtyard wall and hanged, together, in a single mass execution, from a ship's cable stretched between a pillar and the roof, their necks caught in nooses in a row, so that, in the poem's own carefully observed image, they struggle for a little while, like doves or thrushes caught in a snare, and then go still. The poem describes this. 12 women, forced first to clean up the evidence of a massacre they had no part in planning, then executed, together in a method the text takes visible, almost aesthetic care to describe. And this description exists in a poem that is, at every other point, celebrating the man who ordered it as the story's hero. There's a specific cruelty in the order of operations, because the sequence itself is a decision, not an accident of pacing. The women are made to clean the hall before they learn their own fate, to kneel in the blood of men some of them had shared a bed with, all under the ordinary practical fiction that this is simply the next chore in a long night of chores. Only once the floor is scrubbed clean, once their labor has finished the job of erasing the evidence, are they told what has already been decided about them. The last useful thing these women ever do for the household that owns them is, unknowingly, prepare the very room in which their own deaths will shortly take place. A 13th figure meets an even worse end. The goatherd Melanthius, a male servant who had actively collaborated with the suitors, mocking the disguised beggar and even attempting during the fighting to smuggle weapons to the trapped suitors from the very storeroom Odysseus had emptied, is captured alive and subjected to a mutilation so specific and so brutal that most modern retellings simply omit it. His nose and ears cut off, his hands and feet cut off, his genitals torn away and thrown to the dogs, while he is still alive to experience it, before he is finally killed. No trial, no distinction preserved between the maid who was raped by a suitor with no power to refuse him and the maid who chose an alliance she calculated might protect her. No mercy extended on the basis of the same impossible conditions that the poem itself, elsewhere, describes with sympathy, when it's describing what the suitors did to the household, rather than what the household's most powerless members did to survive them. The bodies are removed, the blood is washed away. The house, in the story's own words, is cleansed. The one who almost breaks the pattern. There is a single moment inside this machine where something like resistance flickers. Not rebellion, nothing so dramatic, but a genuine human hesitation, and it belongs to the oldest woman in the household,
Odysseus's own childhood nurse, Eurycleia. It's Eurycleia who, washing the beggar's feet early in his return, recognizes an old hunting scar on his leg and realizes, in a jolt of shock, exactly who she is touching. Nearly crying out loud enough to expose him, Odysseus grabs her by the throat in that moment and threatens her directly. Reveal what she knows, and he will kill her himself, nurse or no nurse, along with everyone else when the reckoning comes. She keeps his secret. She has to decide in that instant whether to protect the household she has served her whole life, including presumably some of the very maids who will later hang, or protect the man standing in front of her with his hand at her throat. She chooses him, because that is the only choice a woman in her position has ever really had. And later, after the slaughter, it's Eurycleia who Odysseus asks to identify which of the maids were disloyal, trusting her decades of intimate knowledge of the household to supply the list of names that becomes, functionally, a death warrant. The one person in this entire machine positioned to advocate, even quietly, for context, for mercy, for the impossible conditions those women survived under, becomes instead an instrument of their sorting. Because even loyalty in this house requires silence. And even the one voice capable of complicating the verdict chooses, in the end, not to. That's what a functioning machine of violence actually needs, more than executioners. It needs ordinary people embedded close enough to see the whole truth, who calculate, correctly, given what's at stake for them personally, that the safest available choice is to go along with the sorting rather than complicate it. The one interrogation he doesn't survive, unchallenged. There is exactly one person in this entire story who subjects Odysseus to the same scrutiny he has spent the whole night applying to everyone else, and it's worth noting who it is. It isn't a servant, and it isn't a son. It's his wife. When Eurycleia rushes upstairs to tell Penelope that the beggar was Odysseus all along, that the suitors are dead, that her husband has finally come home, Penelope does not run downstairs weeping with joy. She goes cautiously, silently, and sits across the hall from a bathed, freshly dressed man claiming to be her husband, and says nothing at all, studying him, while Telemachus, furious at what he reads as coldness, accuses her of having a heart harder than stone. She isn't being cold. She is doing, in miniature, exactly what Odysseus has spent the last several days doing to everyone in that household. Testing, verifying, refusing to commit trust until the evidence is airtight. Except she is doing it to the one person in the story who has spent 20 years building an entire identity around impersonating whoever a situation requires him to be. She has watched gods disguise this man's appearance more than once. She has no way of confirming, just from a face and a claim, that this is really him. So she sets a trap of her own, a small, quiet, brilliant one. She orders a servant to move the bed out of the couple's bedchamber and make it up elsewhere for the stranger to sleep in. It's a test only the real Odysseus can pass, because the bed cannot be moved. Years earlier, when he built the bedroom itself, Odysseus had carved the bed frame directly out of the living trunk of an olive tree still rooted in the ground, then built the walls and roof of the room around it. A bed that is not furniture at all, but architecture, immovable by design, a secret known only to the two of them and one trusted servant. Odysseus reacts to the order with genuine alarm, asking, with an edge of real anger, who has dared cut through his olive tree? And it's that reaction, that specific, unfakeable knowledge, that finally satisfies her. Only then does Penelope weep and embrace him, and the marriage is confirmed. Notice what just happened.
Because it's the single moment in the entire poem where Odysseus is on the receiving end of exactly the technique he's used on everyone else all night. Patient verification, trust withheld until proof arrives, a test designed by someone who has learned the hard way that appearances in this house cannot be trusted. Penelope passes her own test as flawlessly as her husband ever has, and the poem rewards her for it with one of the only unambiguously tender scenes in the whole story. Which makes it worth asking why the exact same instinct for careful verification that earns Penelope the poem's admiration is the instinct that, applied by Odysseus to 12 enslaved women a few hours earlier, ended in a mass hanging instead of an embrace. The difference isn't the method. The difference is which side of the power in that house you were standing on when the question started. Return to the hall. Go back one more time to the woman we opened with. We don't know her name. None of the 12 do. Homer gives us exactly one of the maids by name, Melantho, singled out for her contempt toward the disguised beggar and her relationship with a suitor. And even she exists in the text primarily as an example, a demonstration of exactly the kind of behavior that earns the noose, rather than as a person the story is interested in beyond that function. The other 11 are simply the maids, a category, a number. 12 women who survived 20 years of occupation through whatever combination of endurance, negotiation, and quiet compromise their captivity required, and whose entire individual histories, fears, relationships, private reasoning get compressed in the story that has outlived them by 3,000 years into a single collective sentence and a single collective punishment. We don't know if any of them had children. We don't know if any had been promised freedom or had families elsewhere on the island still waiting for word of them. The poem doesn't ask, because the poem was never built to wonder about any of it. It had a homecoming to get to. Their story doesn't get told as tragedy. It gets told as cleansing, the necessary, almost hygienic final step in restoring a household to order, mentioned in roughly the same tone as scrubbing blood off a floor. Because in the moral accounting of this text, that is essentially what they are, a stain that needed removing before the story of the hero's homecoming could be considered complete. The architect's ending. Meanwhile, the man responsible for all of it gets an entirely different kind of ending. Odysseus reclaims his throne. He's reunited with his wife and son. He lives on across 3,000 years of retelling as one of the defining heroes of the entire Western literary tradition. Intelligence, resilience, the man who endured everything and came home. Statues, epithets, an adjective, Odyssean, that has entered half a dozen languages as a synonym for an epic, admirable journey. Children are still named for him. Businesses are still named for him. A NASA mission was named for him. It very nearly doesn't end that cleanly. Word of the massacre spreads across the island within a day, and the fathers of the dead suitors, 108 households who have just learned their sons were killed in a locked room with no trial, no warning, do exactly what this culture's entire logic of honor and blood vengeance demands of them. They arm themselves. They march on the palace, led by Antinous' grieving father, intending to kill Odysseus and Telemachus in turn, and by every rule this story has spent the whole episode establishing, they have every right to. This is the moment where the poem's own internal logic threatens to swallow it whole. If violence answered by violence is how this world restores order, and that is precisely the justification offered for everything that happened in that hall, then 108 dead sons demand exactly the kind of reckoning Odysseus just delivered. The blood feud, in this world's own terms, should now simply continue. Endlessly, the way blood feuds always do once they start. It doesn't happen. Not because anyone in the story finds a moral argument that resolves it, Because the goddess Athena physically intervenes, descending, in the poem's own account, to stop the fighting by force, striking fear into the approaching fathers and commanding both sides, on pain of her own divine wrath, to accept peace and never speak of the killings again. The war stops because a god orders it to stop. Not because justice is served, not because anyone is held accountable, not because the 108 fathers receive so much as an accounting of what happened in that hall or why.
The story ends the cycle by fiat, from above, because the poet needs the ending to be a homecoming, rather than the opening chapter of an endless island civil war. And because acknowledging, honestly, that the fathers had a legitimate grievance would have required the poem to take their side seriously even for a moment, which it was never built to do. Notice, too, what that divine command actually is: silence. Never speak of the killings again. The suitors' fathers are ordered by a goddess to stop talking about their dead sons, to accept an erasure imposed on them from outside, exactly the way the 12 hanged maids were erased from within. The poem doesn't examine what it costs those households to comply. It simply reports that they do, and moves on to the reunion it actually wants to end on. The gap, one final time. His ending: honor, restoration, a legacy so secure it has outlasted the civilization that produced it by nearly 3 millennia.
Their ending? Silence. A shared grave nobody bothered to mark individually, and a footnote in someone else's story. This gap is not an accident of how the story happened to be transmitted. It is, this show would argue, the actual mechanism by which heroic narrative is manufactured, not despite the suffering of the powerless caught in its wake, but through the systematic, almost automatic erasure of that suffering from the frame the story asks you to care about. Nobody sat down and decided to villainize Odysseus and then changed their mind. The story was never built to weigh his actions against theirs in the first place. It was built, from its very first line, to follow the man with the sword. And the poem's own extraordinary artistry, because it is genuinely one of the great achievements of human storytelling, has spent 3,000 years making that follow feel not just natural, but right.
Memory and reinterpretation. That framing has not gone entirely unchallenged, and it's worth being honest about the long tradition of readers who have felt the wrongness underneath the celebration. Ancient tragedians occasionally returned to these events with a harder eye. Euripides, writing centuries after Homer, built entire plays around the suffering of Troy's captured women, giving Hecuba and Andromache the kind of interior voice the epic tradition never extends to the powerless. In the modern era, feminist classicists and post-colonial scholars have spent decades reading the poem against its own grain, asking what the text looks like from the position of the people it treats as scenery. Contemporary novelists have written entire books from Circe's perspective, from Penelope's perspective, and one, Margaret Atwood, went all the way down the hierarchy. Her retelling of this story is narrated by Penelope from the underworld and haunted, chapter after chapter, by a chorus of the 12 hanged maids themselves, who interrupt the narrative to sing, accuse, and refuse to stay erased. It took nearly 3,000 years for someone to build a book around them. That's how deep the original erasure ran. There is one strand of the older tradition worth lingering on, because it's the closest the ancient and medieval world ever came to formally indicting him. More than 1,000 years after Homer, Dante, mapping his vision of hell, places Odysseus, Ulysses in the Latin, not among the heroes, but deep in the 8th circle, among the committers of fraud, punished as a false counselor, a man whose gift for cunning speech was used to deceive rather than to guide.
Dante has him burn eternally for exactly the qualities Homer spent an entire epic asking us to admire: the horse, the deception, the manipulation of trust as a tool of war. It's a striking judgment, And it suggests that the discomfort this episode has been tracing isn't some modern, retroactive imposition. Someone, somewhere along the long chain of retellings, was already uneasy enough to send him to hell for it. And yet, even that condemnation gets answered, centuries later, when Tennyson writes his own Odysseus, an old man, restless on the throne he fought so hard to reclaim, choosing to gather his old crew. The crew that, in Homer's own account, is entirely dead under his command, for one final voyage into the unknown. It's a magnificent poem.
It is also a staggering piece of myth laundering. A man abandoning, yet again, the family and kingdom he spent 20 years fighting to get back to, reframed not as abandonment, but as noble restlessness, the mark of a soul too large for domestic life. But none of that critical work has meaningfully dented the poem's central cultural function. Odysseus is still, by an enormous margin, remembered as a hero. There has been no formal acknowledgement, within the tradition itself, that the disloyal maids and the vengeful god Poseidon and the monstrous Cyclops might all, from a different angle, be looking at the exact same man and seeing something the epic never quite lets you see head-on.
What this tells us.
Here's the uncomfortable thing this episode keeps circling. The thing every episode of this show eventually circles, because it turns out to be true across 3,000 years of very different empires. The qualities a violent, hierarchical world rewards as heroism, cunning, ruthlessness, the willingness to deceive and to kill efficiently, are, from the position of anyone standing beneath that hierarchy, functionally indistinguishable from the qualities that make a man dangerous to be near. Odysseus is not a monster in the way some other subjects of this show are monsters. There's no evidence he took pleasure in cruelty for its own sake, no indication he sought out victims beyond what he judged his situation required. That's almost what makes him more useful to study, not less. He is, by every measure his own culture used, a good man doing exactly what his world asked of him: clever, loyal to his family, patient, pious, willing to endure extraordinary hardship to get home to the people he loved. And the machine that world built around him still produced a locked room, 108 corpses, and 12 women hanged from a ship's cable for the crime of having survived an occupation they never asked for, judged by a standard that only ever existed in one man's head. Modern researchers, who study how ordinary, non-sadistic people come to carry out atrocities, keep landing on the mechanism this story dramatizes almost perfectly, 3,000 years before anyone had a word for it. The circle of people whose suffering registers as morally weighty, the in-group, in the language of the field, is never fixed. Penelope is inside Odysseus's circle, and her interrogation of him earns tenderness. The suitors' fathers are, briefly, almost inside it, close enough that a god has to physically intervene to keep the story from having to reckon with their grief. The 12 maids are never inside it at all, close enough to be useful, distant enough to be disposable. Exactly the condition this research keeps identifying as the precondition for this kind of violence. Nobody in that hall had to be persuaded that cruelty was good. They only had to believe that the 12 women being marched out to the courtyard wall weren't quite the same category of person as the ones being wept over and embraced. And the archaeology backs up the world this story describes more than most people expect from what sounds like pure fantasy. Excavated Linear B tablets from Bronze Age palace archives. The actual, bureaucratic paperwork of kingdoms, very much like the Ithaca this story imagines, record in blunt administrative language ration allotments for enslaved women and their children, grouped by trade and by the location they were taken from. Women whose labor kept these palace economies running, and whose names, when they appear at all, appear only as inventory. The 12 hanged maids are not a poetic invention layered onto a gentler reality.
They are, if anything, a rare moment where that invisible administrative class of women briefly becomes visible enough to be given a fate the poem bothers to describe at all, and only because their deaths serve the story's real subject. Closing voice. Picture her one more time. Not any single woman, because the tradition never let us have that. A composite.
A voice standing in for 12, and for every household like it, on every island like this one. In every version of this story, the ancient world told itself and called glory. We learned to survive him. That was our mistake. He did not come back to be survived. Say her name. You can't. Nobody ever wrote it down, not in the poem, not in the tablets, not in the 3,000 years of commentary that followed. Libraries of scholarship on the man who owned her, and not one line anywhere asking what she was called before the rope. That's not an accident of history. That's how this particular kind of story has always worked. Not just this one, but every version of it, in every empire, in every century since. The men who architect the violence get names, statues, epithets that outlive their civilizations, poems written in their honor by poets not yet born when the blood was still on the floor. The people standing beneath them when the weapons finally come out get a number, if they're lucky, a category, a single collective sentence in someone else's triumph, filed somewhere between the axe heads and the sulfur used to scrub the hall clean. Remember that gap. You're going to see it again.